Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of various aspects of Japanese culture, including TV. And one of the videos that I made a couple of years ago about a show called Midnight Diner has had a lot of attention, and I thought I'd make a little video about some comparable shows that I've been watching recently. A bunch of them I have already reviewed, so I'm going to focus today on a few pieces that I haven't talked about. And I'm going to start by looking at a show called Dr. Koto's Clinic, which is actually it's 20 years old in its original incarnation. And if you're familiar with Midnight Diner, for example, you'll know that the guy who plays the master is Kobayashi Kaoru, and he appears in Dr. Koto's Clinic as part of the ensemble. He's a local government administrator. Dr. Koto's Clinic is a show about a doctor from Tokyo who has made some sort of mistake. It's not entirely clear initially what that mistake is, and it's debatable as to the extent to which it really is a mistake. But it stars Hidetaka Yoshioka, who you might know from a number of things, including Godzilla -1 recently. And he plays the doctor who moves to this remote southwestern island. In terms of, it's an imaginary place, but in terms of the islands that it's modeled on, it's actually closer to Taiwan than it is to Japan, though everybody, of course, speaks Japanese, and it's clearly a Japanese culture. And he sets up as the local doctor.
20年前、星野さんが先生をこの島に呼んでくれて、感謝してもしきれません。じゃあ、家族みたいなもんですから。夢が迎え
The locals are, for the most part, born and bred locals. Most of them haven't traveled that much. Most of them are not particularly educated. And they're suspicious of him because they've had bad experiences with doctors in the past who either came reluctantly, they didn't want to be there, they were not particularly well qualified or trained, or they didn't speak Japanese. Because there's very little on the island. It's quite primitive in terms of technology. There's no cell phones. Computer access seems to be pretty limited, and most people are only there because they were born there and have lived all their lives there. Not many people come in from outside, so they're skeptical of this new doctor. This is a familiar trope, of course. It's reminiscent in terms of British and American shows recently of something like Death in Paradise, which is a detective show set in the Caribbean, and something like Doc Martin, which is also a doctor show in which a high-profile doctor moves to a little rural community. The difference is that Dr. Koto, his real name is Goto, but they get it wrong, and he becomes effectively Dr. Koto, which is interesting of itself because it suggests the way that being in a particular place transforms your function and identity. He gets a new name for what is effectively a new life. But he actually wants to be there. And unlike many of these medical shows or detective shows where there is a particularly gifted person, usually a man, at the center of the story, he's actually a nice guy who's invested in the community and trying to do a good job, you know? Unlike, say, a Dr. House or Doc Martin, who are kind of assholes, who get away with behaving badly because they're very good at their job. And one of the things that draws me to Japanese TV is thinking about what tonally makes it different from British and American TV, which I consume in large quantities as well, critically, right? If you've spent any time on this channel, you'll know that I'm a fan, I'm an enthusiast, but I'm also always interrogating what's going on here, what it means, what it's about, what its implications are, and so on. No less with these. The difference is that This is a particular kind of Japanese show which ultimately has a very sort of feel-good kind of thrust. And it's about the way that the show frames the core characters' relationships to each other and their sense of community. And in some ways, when I'm talking about that change of name from Goto to Koto, I think that's sort of the core idea of the show, the idea that this guy goes to this remote place to try and be a doctor, to try and be a better doctor than he was in Tokyo, and the isolation of the place, the natural rootedness of it. It's a beautiful show. It's all fields and coastline and open sea. Creates both a sense of his own isolation, which forces him to look inward, and reaffirms the importance of community, a community which is about connection to other people, to family, and to found family, including his patients, where when we encounter, there are 2 seasons of this show, plus a movie, which I'll talk about in a minute. In the 2 seasons of the show, we occasionally see doctors from the mainland, and they don't come off looking so good, you know? And that's partly because they are trained to think exclusively clinically, which makes them somewhat robotic, which might make their critical judgment better, sharper in certain respects, but it takes away the human element. They see being emotionally invested in your patients as a bad thing that clouds your judgment. The show, of course, doesn't feel that, and it frequently celebrates Dr. Koto's investment, his very personal investment in his patients as part of his own process of forgiving himself and training himself to be a better human being. It's a small, quiet, sometimes slow show, but it retains a sense of the environment of the extended village, which is what this island really is. So a lot of characters recur throughout the show. Each episode may have a core case at its heart, but there's continuity that moves on. The 2 seasons were shot, I think, 3 years apart. So there's a sense of a lot of things changing in the course of the show. And the new movie was filmed like 20 years later, though it features the same cast. It's not a remake. It's like an extension of the original core group 20 years on. Unfortunately, I can't see that. Everything else is on Netflix. The film is not. I don't seem to be able to find it. If anybody has tips or suggestions as to where we can get it, I would like to see it, just to see how some of the sort of macro stories get revisited later. But I recommend it. It's good. And, you know, it's sweet and optimistic and positive, but not without tragedy, which I think is a good balance. You know, there's a lot of things that work out surprisingly well, but it's earned in part because occasionally they don't. So like a lot of medical shows, of course, it's dealing with real stuff. And sometimes that real stuff is tough. And I think it also touches on social issues that are specifically Japanese and which are getting a lot more attention. Things like domestic abuse, for example, which shows up in the 2nd season and reflects the larger community sort of the nation wrestling with some of these macro concerns. One of the recurring issues also is that the island is a sort of micro community, which is in some ways separate from the bureaucracy and the political and economic world of mainstream Japan, and especially urban Japan. And when those things show up in the show, they tend to be reflected negatively. And I think that this is a persistent theme in a lot of comparatively recent Japanese TV, this craving for a kind of nostalgic return to something that is an escape from specifically 21st century problems about economics and political corruption and things like that. Early in the show, we see, somebody, a politician from the mainland coming, whose agenda is to turn the island into a dumping ground for waste. And that this is, from the island's perspective, this is all they're good for. And there's this sense of the old ways of life, relying on the sea and their local community, constantly sort of in danger of collapse as people leave the island, young people leave the island for a better life elsewhere. Though, of course, the running question throughout the show is it actually better? If from the perspective of the Doctor, who's come to the island to get away from all that, then the answer is kind of no. So that's that. That's Dr. Koto's Clinic. So there's another show. The title is a little confusing because it appears in a number of different versions. Old Rookie and Old Dog New Tricks ? Neither title of which is particularly evocative or distinctive, but it's also on Netflix. It stars Go Ayano as a retired soccer player. He's turned 37. He has been successful to a point as a soccer player. He's occasionally, he used to play in the top tier in Japan and managed to play for the national team, I think 4 times, and scored a particularly decisive goal in a key tournament when he came on as a substitute. And this is his sort of moment of glory. But he's now 37. He's been injured. His rankings within the Japanese league has gradually sort of slipped division by division down to the bottom, and eventually, and the team that he's in now has basically filed for bankruptcy, and he's out of work. And he's the center of the story. You'll know him from things like MIU 404, from Dr. Storks, which I've talked about before on this channel, and a number of other things. Very successful actor, very charismatic, and presents here as elsewhere this very sort of interesting energy, sort of almost childlike enthusiasm, which is similar to Dr. Koto in some ways, though Dr. Koto is a very quiet presence. Sometimes you want him to be a little louder and to sort of fight his corner a little bit more, but he's a very demure presence, whereas the characters that Go Ayano plays tend to be brighter, more upbeat and quirky. He's basically out of work, and it's interesting because it's a little bit reminiscent of something like the representation of Roy Kent in Ted Lasso, right? That sense of somebody at the end of their career when the career is kind of all they've known how to do. So they're dealing with the sheer economic realities of shifting from being, at one point in his career, a superstar, a sportsman, an athlete, with a family, and suddenly he's struggling to support them, and he's constantly sort of drawn back to these sort of moments of glory from his soccer playing past and doesn't know what to put in its place, quite literally, So initially the difficulty is him trying to find a job and him struggling to give up on the idea of somehow revitalizing his career as a football player. His family are very supportive and positive, but his eldest daughter really struggles with his retirement from football, and she doesn't understand it. They sort of idolize him. They rewatch the video of him scoring this key goal over and over, and she can't handle him no longer being a football player, and she won't speak to him. And it's this really sort of sad tension, and underscores the sense that this is not simply a question of him trying to find work. It's about him trying to figure out who he is for himself and for his family when he can't do the one thing that he loves.
泉どうだサッカー楽しいだろ泉
今からでも話来ないかなどこでもいいから
現役復帰したら口聞いてくれるだろ泉もお姉さんも
マネジメントの仕事は楽しくなってきたけどでもサッカーも
So he finishes up working for a sports management company, basically becomes an agent. It's a little bit like, Jerry Maguire or something like that, except that, again, the worldview here in these shows is ultimately kind of benevolent, a sense of positivity and of people working for each other and trying to reaffirm the importance of human connection in the face of business pressures. And that's sort of the heart of the show. All the ups and downs that he experiences working as an agent are about him wanting to believe in athletes and as people and to connect with them and to help them in their lives when the company that he's working for is taking a very hard and pragmatic view of the finances and how their reputation is going to be affected by working with a certain athlete and how their bottom line is affected by working with this athlete. And so that's kind of the tension throughout. And in this sense, I think it's quite like Dr. Koto, the sense that the human connection is what's being celebrated by these shows, but you feel like it's under attack from the outside all the time. Under attack by what is effectively the dominant cultural form within contemporary culture, which is the impulse to be profitable and successful and to hold a view of human relationships which are ultimately business relationships rather than grounded in friendship or love or other basic human emotions. It's a one-season show. It's fun and entertaining and occasionally quite poignant, especially with the family stuff. But ultimately, of course, as I say, it's an upbeat show. It's a feel-good show. And I say this sort of unapologetically. I watch a lot of really dark stuff. And the world, don't get me started. Yeah. I need shows like this to keep me going sometimes. Let's just say that. And again, I would say, another parallel between Old Dog New Tricks and Dr. Koto's clinic is that sense that, again, we have somebody at the center of the show who has a real talent, who's gifted. But the fact that he's gifted doesn't make him a jackass. In fact, part of what makes him gifted is his faith in other people, his desire to connect with other people and to be part of their lives, as opposed to the sort of archetypal maverick who is a genius in certain respects, but somebody you don't want to be around and somebody who will cheerfully throw you under the bus. Speaking of which, I think in contrast to a show like this is something like News Anchor.
ちょっと新しい風と言いますか、さまざまな考え方があることが分かりましてね。まあ、聞いてもらった方が早いですね。
正直、ニュースゲートって若い人は全く見てないですから。伝統と歴史のある番組って局長や P、編集長もみんないますけど、要するに
違う、これは新藤さんに話合わせて。
そもそもテレビなんてオワコンじゃないですか。
This is a show. Parts of it I liked, and parts of it I thought sort of redeemed themselves late in the season. But I get irritated with these shows that are built around the genius guy who is impossible to work with, who's rude. This is such a sort of stereotype of a certain kind of Japanese show, and it's getting really old for me. And it's almost always a guy, because mostly women don't get away with this kind of behavior in Japan. I think one exception to that rule is something like Miss Sherlock, which I loved. But Miss Sherlock, she's a kind of an outsider, and most people don't take her terribly seriously. So even though she has that sort of Sherlock Holmes gift and is weird and rude and doesn't play by the normal social conventions, she doesn't get power from that because she's sort of an outcast. When it's a man in that position, they're frequently powerful people, and I think we're supposed to sort of be impressed by them, and I'm frequently not. I just find them annoying. And it's particularly galling to see the way in something like News Anchor that all the women around him have to sort of constantly deal with his bullshit, his refusal to tell them what he's working on and to keep his secrets in the pursuit of the scoop and to behave badly, and it's frustrating. And to me, it significantly undermined my enjoyment of the show, even though in many ways he turns out not to be a bad guy and is working towards a good thing. The core actor's demeanor, his smugness, his sort of smirking self-assurance, I found, I wanted to punch him. By contrast, I would say there's a new show called The Journalist, which does something similar. Both of these shows involve tackling government corruption, which is very much a current preoccupation in Japan for obvious reasons, given the state of the LDP. And one of the things that's fascinating about The Journalist is that it centers on a female newspaper reporter who's trying to sort of force the issue in terms of unpacking what has been going on with what seems to be a corrupt land deal involving the Prime Minister and his wife, which has been buried by the government, and they've lied about it to protect powerful people. And then it looks increasingly like they have then put pressure on a local prefectural government office to alter or delete records which don't square with the version of the story that the government is trying to tell. And the journalist is trying to get to the bottom of it. And the show features both Go Ayano from the soccer show and Hiritaka Yoshioka from Dr. Koto's clinic.
ここには都合の良くないものが存在している。
それはどういうことでしょうか。
答弁を事実にしないと。
これは解散です。
鎮火作業に移れ。この件はこれで終わりだ。
この事件は闇に埋もれていい問題ではありません。
状況から考えて明らかに口利きがあったのではと推測されます。官邸の関与があったのではないですか。
一記者がこんな攻めたところで何も変わんなくない？
京都新聞の松田と申します。お話を伺えますか？
お話しすることは何もないと思います。
野党の追及や新聞社の報道には困ってますよ。
暇なんですよ。謎の正義感で生きてる。
これは世の中に出す意義があります。
私は自分の仕事を全うしたまでです。
俺、大変なことしちゃったかもしれない。
権力に忖度しろってことですか？
人生って最初から決められてる気がしてきた。
最近気になったニュースなどありますか？
なんなのこれ。
これは国家の安定につながるんでしょうか。
これからの政治はパフォーマンスですから。
なんでここまでやるんですか？
私は一人になっても戦い続けますから。
国民のために仕事をしていました。
罪悪感を抱えて生きていくことがどれほど辛いかわからないでしょう。
本当のことを話してください。
何があったか知りたいです。
政権がひっくり返るかもしれんぞ。
この国は変わらないといけないんです。
Go Ayano plays a bureaucrat working for the government, and it's amazing to see the transformation of his self-presentation in this show. As I said before, he's generally this sort of ebullient, effusive, quirky, positive character. In this, he's the opposite. He's this sort of drained, grey, by-the-book bureaucrat who is sort of constantly trying to protect himself and the people above him. And it's interesting, a lot the previous shows that I mentioned are both really sort of colorful, vibrant, highly saturated shows. This is the opposite. This is gray and bleak and depressing, and a lot of it is filmed in sort of basement offices and things like that. The light is very blue, so that he particularly looks as gray as his suit most of the time, which I think is symbolically appropriate. This is a man who's had the sort of humanity sucked out of him. Dr. Koto now is playing a significantly older local bureaucrat who's one of the people who has been forced to destroy documents, and it is tearing him apart because he knows that what he's doing is wrong, but he's under tremendous pressure to go along with his superiors and ultimately with the Prime Minister's offices and so on. And it's bleak, man. It's really grim to watch. And I think that part of the power, this is interesting to me, that part of the power of the show is knowing him from these other shows. And I think the same is true of Goiano. That I've written about this in regard to watching actors doing Shakespeare and the way that often previous roles underscore the part that they're currently playing. I remember the first time I met Patrick Stewart backstage after he was playing Antony in Antony and Cleopatra, and I was primarily familiar with him from Star Trek The Next Generation, which I knew inside out, and was something that my wife and I watched a lot when we were younger. And so seeing him, it was really fascinating the way that his role as Antony was somehow informed by these other television roles, which were, of course, completely different. But it's like alternate universes that sort of slide together. I remember seeing David Tennant playing Hamlet at the height of his Doctor Who fame. And it was fascinating. You could feel the energy in the audience about how excited they were. And there were a couple of moments where his delivery of the Shakespeare had this real sort of Doctor Who energy, and it was fascinating to see the way that the character took shape. So I think the same is true. Something similar is going on here. And part of why The Journalist is so hard to watch is because you're watching these guys who you know from very different kinds of roles who are now spent, broken, just sort of drained and torn apart by the nature of the world that they are now living in. And it feels really, really hard. You know, the show is really good. It's comparatively short. It's only, I think, 5 episodes, something like that. The other shows are like 11 episodes. This one is brief, and it's a bit like All the President's Men, which is, the movie about the investigations into Nixon by the Washington Post, and moves to the point at which everything comes out into the public and you don't see the aftermath. Well, something similar is going on here. It's the investigation into the land deal. But here the show isn't simply about joining the dots and making the case, collecting evidence. It's about watching people who are used to following what their superiors have told them to do and watching them wrestle with the moral implication that what they're doing is bad, and that the ideological apparatus within which they have operated, the idea that your senpai, your superiors know what they're doing and have your best interests at heart, is a lie. And as I say, it's very topical. It speaks very much to a lot of mood in contemporary Japan about political and economic issues. But it's also this sort of profoundly personal sense of loss and failure when you feel like some of the things that are fundamental to the job that you have been doing, the society and culture that you've been living in, turn out not to be the things that you thought they were at all. And you're implicated, right? That all the things that you thought you were doing for other people, and it turns out what you're doing is feathering the nests of the most powerful. You're putting money in their pocket, and it's corrupt. It's heartbreaking, and watching these people sort of pushed into a situation, watching them trying to make the decision to actually do the right thing, which means turning against their superiors, which is incredibly difficult to do, partly because of the pressures that they can put on you professionally, but also just this sense of trying to escape from the mindset that the people above me know what they're doing. So it's a tough watch, but I really recommend it. And that's all I'm going to say. If you have other recommendations, if there are other Japanese shows that you've been watching recently that you think I might be interested in or interested in talking about, please recommend them in the comments. I'd be interested to hear what you think about these shows as well. And that's all. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe, check out my books, particularly, of course, the Hideki Smith series. We just released the second in that series, Hideki Smith and the Omukade, and the first one has just come out in Japanese. So check those out. Check out my Patreon page. There's a link in the description to my Patreon page, and all my patrons get to see these videos a little bit in advance of everybody else, and they make this channel possible. Without it, I wouldn't be able to justify it because it's not monetized. So buy a book, join my Patreon page. I also have a little Dashery store for shirts and things like that. That's it. I'll talk to you soon. Cheers. Bye.